The dust from the convoy still hung in the air, a thin, gritty veil that settled on the shoulders of every soldier standing in formation. The sun over the forward operating base was a merciless white brand in the sky, baking the cracked earth and the metal of the Humvees until they were too hot to touch. Staff Sergeant Alyssa Chen stood at the edge of the parade ground, her gaze fixed on the solitary figure walking toward the assembled troops. The figure was female, her gait was steady, and her posture was rigid with a purpose that had nothing to do with the military protocols of the day. This was not a court-martial. This was not a promotion ceremony. This was something far more ancient and far more personal. This was a reckoning. The woman walking toward the 282 soldiers of the battalion was Captain Elena Vance. To the outside world, she was a decorated logistics officer, a woman who had orchestrated supply routes through hostile territory with the precision of a master watchmaker. But to one man in that formation, she was simply his wife. And to Alyssa Chen, who had shared a tent with Elena for 6 months, she was a sister-in-arms who had just emerged from a private hell. 3 days prior, the base had been buzzing with a rumor so wild that most dismissed it as the kind of bored gossip that fermented in the desert heat. The rumor was that Captain Vance had broken her husband's arm. Not in a fall, not in an accident, but deliberately. The story had evolved through countless retellings by the time it reached Alyssa's ears. Some said it was over an affair. Others said it was a fight over money. When the most lurid versions claimed it was a drunken brawl between two hot-headed military brats. Alyssa knew better. She knew because she was the one Elena had come to first, her hands still shaking, her face pale not with fear, but with a cold, terrible resolve. It had been just after 2100 hours when Alyssa heard the knock on her hooch door. She had opened it to find Elena, still in her civilian clothes, a light blouse stained with a few drops of blood that were not her own. "I need you to document this," Elena had said, her voice flat. "I need a witness." Alyssa had pulled her inside, forcing her to sit on the edge of the cot. The overhead light was harsh, illuminating the faint red marks on Elena's forearm, the beginning of a bruise on her bicep where fingers had dug in too hard. "Tell me everything," Alyssa had demanded. "And from the beginning, leave nothing out." And Elena had. She spoke in the same clipped, efficient tone she used for after-action reports. She had gone home on a 48-hour pass to see her husband, Mark. Mark was a civilian contractor, a former soldier himself, who had been struggling with the transition back to civilian life. The isolation, the lack of structure, the feeling of being left behind while his wife continued to serve, it had festered in him like an infected wound. The first night had been tense. He drank too much. He made comments about her being gone, about her playing soldier while he was stuck holding down the fort. Elena, trained to de-escalate, had tried to soothe him, to remind him that this was temporary, that her career was winding down. But the demon in him was not looking for logic. It was looking for a target. The second night, it escalated. He accused her of infidelity, a baseless charge born of his own insecurity. When she refused to engage, when she turned to walk away and go back to the base early, he snapped. He grabbed her arm, whirling her around. The element of surprise was his only ally. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and strong, but he was untrained and sloppy with rage. He raised his other hand, not to hit her, but to grab her face, to force her to look at him, to submit to his dominance. That was his mistake. In that split second, the wife in civilian clothes vanished, and Captain Elena Vance, the officer who had run logistics for a battalion in a combat zone, took over. Her mind did not process him as a husband. It processed him as an aggressor. The threat was imminent. The distance was closed. And the response was automatic. As his hand reached for her face, she did not pull back. She stepped inside his reach, breaking his grip on her arm with a sharp, downward twist of her own. The move was fluid, a technique drilled into muscle memory hundreds of times in combatives training. He was off balance, his weight forward. She pivoted, using his momentum against him. Her left hand shot up, not to strike, but to control his arm, to lock his wrist. In one continuous motion, she dropped her center of gravity, rotated her hips, and applied leverage to the fulcrum of his elbow joint. There was a sickening, wet crack that echoed in the small kitchen of their on-base housing. It sounded like a thick tree branch snapping under a heavy load. Mark screamed. It was a high, keening wail of agony that was entirely at odds with the blustering anger of moments before. He crumpled to the linoleum floor, cradling his arm, his face contorted in shock and pain. His humerus, the long bone of the upper arm, had snapped cleanly just above the elbow joint. The arm was useless, hanging at a grotesque angle. Elena stood over him, her breath coming in controlled gasps. The adrenaline was roaring in her ears, but her mind was terrifyingly clear. She looked at him, not with pity, but with a clinical assessment. The threat was neutralized. She had not killed him. She had not even meant to cause this much damage. She had meant to control him. But her body, honed by years of service, had chosen the most efficient path to ensure her own safety. She had called the MPS herself. She had waited for them on the front steps, her back straight, her expression blank. She had given her statement without a tremor in her voice. She had detailed the assault on her person and her subsequent defensive reaction. The MPs had looked at the state of Mark's arm, looked at her calm demeanor, and then looked at the bruises already darkening on her skin. The math was simple. Now, 3 days later, the battalion commander had made an unusual call. He had ordered a full formation. He had ordered Mark, his arm now in a heavy cast and a sling, to stand before the troops. And he had ordered Captain Vance to walk through the ranks of her peers, to be seen, to be witnessed. The official reason was to promote unit cohesion and address interpersonal conduct. The real reason was far more primal. The commander, a grizzled old veteran of multiple campaigns, she understood that a story like this would spread like wildfire. If left to the rumor mill, it would become a tawdry tale of domestic dysfunction. He was determined to control the narrative. He was determined that his soldiers see the truth. So, as the 282 soldiers stood at parade rest, a sea of desert camouflage and polished boots, Captain Vance began her walk. The sun was brutal. Sweat trickled down temples and soaked into collar stays, but no one moved. No one coughed. The only sound was the crunch of Elena's boots on the hard ground. Alyssa watched from her position in the front row. She saw the faces of the soldiers as Elena passed. There were the young privates, their eyes wide, trying to understand the gravity of what they were witnessing. There were the sergeants, their faces carved from stone, giving nothing away. And there were the other women, the female officers and NCOs. In their eyes, Alyssa saw a flicker of something else. It was a profound and silent recognition. It was the look of women who had all, at some point in their lives, calculated the risk of a dark street, a locked room, a man's raised voice. They saw in Elena not a victim, and not an aggressor, but a survivor who had fought back. Elena's gaze was fixed forward, but she was acutely aware of the weight of those 282 pairs of eyes. She felt no shame. She felt no pride. She felt a bone-deep weariness and a strange, hollow clarity. She had spent her entire adult life learning to protect her country, her convoy, her troops. It had never occurred to her that she would need to use those same skills to protect herself in her own kitchen. As she passed the final rank, she saw him. Mark stood at the far end, off to the side, a civilian in a world of soldiers. His face was pale under the sun, his arm a stark white beacon of his own shame. He would not look at her. He stared at a point on the ground, his jaw tight. The MPS had not charged him. Elena had refused to press charges for the assault, just as Mark's lawyers were threatening to sue for excessive force and assault. It was a legal stalemate, a no-man's land of a marriage that was now irrevocably shattered. The commander called the formation to attention. His voice boomed across the parade ground. He spoke of the standards of conduct expected of soldiers and their families. He spoke of the resources available for stress and marital issues. He did not mention broken arms or domestic disputes. He did not need to. The message had been delivered not in his words, but in the long, silent walk of Captain Elena Vance. Later that night, Alyssa found Elena sitting alone on the makeshift patio behind the morale tent, a place of sandbags and wooden pallets that looked out onto the endless dark of the desert. The stars were out, a cold, sharp spray against the black velvet sky. Alyssa sat down beside her without a word. She handed her a bottle of cold water. For a long time, they just sat there, listening to the distant hum of generators and the occasional chatter of the radio watch. "You did what you had to do," Alyssa finally said. It was not a question. Elena took a long sip of water. "I know," she said. Her voice was quiet, the hard edge gone from it. "That's the worst part, I know. I looked at him, and I didn't see my husband. I saw a problem. And I solved it." "Good," Alyssa said, her voice firm. "That training kept you alive. It kept you from getting hurt worse." "Physically," Elena agreed. She looked down at her own hands, the hands that had so efficiently broken a man's arm. "But what happens when I go home for good? When there's no front line, no uniform, no enemy? What happens when I look at my husband and all I see is a problem I have to solve?" Alyssa had no answer for that. It was the unspoken fear of every soldier, the ghost that haunted the transition from warrior to civilian. The next few weeks were a blur of official inquiries and legal maneuvering. The Army conducted a mandatory investigation into the incident, given that it involved one of its officers and occurred technically on a military installation. Elena was confined to the base. Her duties shifted to administrative tasks while the investigation ran its course. Mark was barred from the base, his contractor credentials suspended. The rumor mill, despite the commander's best efforts, continued to churn, but its tone had shifted. The story was no longer about a cat fight or a domestic squabble. It was about a soldier who had defended herself. The 282 soldiers who had stood in that formation became the unofficial guardians of the true narrative. When new soldiers arrived and heard the whispers, the old hands would set them straight. "Don't let the scuttlebutt fool you," they'd say. "Captain Vance did what any of us would have to do if we were attacked. She just happened to be better at it than the other guy." The investigation concluded with a finding of justifiable self-defense. The brigade commander, a woman with 25 years of service, called Elena into her office. She did not offer sympathy. She offered respect. "You made a split-second decision based on your training," the colonel said. "It was the right decision. Your actions reflect well on this unit and on the Corps. Don't let anyone tell you different." The colonel then leaned forward, her gaze intense. "But I'm also going to tell you something your mother should have. You cannot fix him. You cannot save him. That marriage is over. The sooner you accept that, the sooner you can heal. And you will need to heal, Captain. Not just your arm, but your head and your heart. That's an order." The words hit Elena harder than any punch Mark could have thrown. They were the permission she didn't know she needed. Permission to stop feeling guilty. Permission to stop trying to piece together the shattered remains of a relationship that had been built on a fault line. She filed for divorce the next week. The papers were served to Mark at his parents' house, where he had retreated to lick his wounds and plot his next move. He tried one last gambit, a civil suit claiming battery and emotional distress. Elena's lawyer, a sharp JAG officer with a ruthless streak, deposed Mark first. Under oath, Mark had to admit to grabbing Elena, to the bruises on her arm, to his history of anger issues since leaving the service. The case was laughed out of pretrial hearings. The image of the hulking ex-soldier suing his much smaller wife for breaking his arm while he was attacking her was a public relations nightmare. His own lawyers advised him to avoid. Months passed. The deployment ended. The battalion rotated home to a hero's welcome at a base in Georgia. There were flags and families and tearful reunions. Elena stood alone among the chaos, watching the embraces. Alyssa, her own husband and kids clinging to her, caught Elena's eye across the tarmac. She gave a small, sad smile. Elena smiled back. It was a start. The physical bruises on her arm had faded long ago. The invisible ones were still there, a dull ache in her psyche. She moved into a small apartment off base, a place that was hers and hers alone. She decorated it sparsely, with things she had chosen, things that had no memory of Mark attached to them. She started running, long, punishing runs in the Georgia humidity, pushing her body until her lungs burned and her legs screamed. It was the only way she knew to quiet the thoughts that circled in her head at night. She thought a lot about those 282 soldiers. They had become, in a strange way, her jury and her vindication. They had seen her at her most vulnerable, stripped of the privacy of her pain, and they had not judged her. They had witnessed her strength. They had stood in the sun and watched her walk, and in their silence they had told her she belonged. One evening, She was invited to speak to a group of new female lieutenants at the base. It was part of a mentorship program.